Psalm 3 is a prayer of deliverance based on David's experience of fleeing from his son Absalom. He was trying to overthrow David to become king. Like many of the Psalms, this one's personal, but it also targets a wider audience, so it models how to process and struggle through our own experiences with God. He says, "Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me?" So he cries out to God by describing the situation and identifying what it is that's troubling him. "Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him." So David's troubled by two levels of distress here. There's the physical threat to his safety, and then there's a psychological one. And so the whole experience is affecting the deepest part of who he is. I think one of the biggest problems in so many churches today is our unwillingness to deal with emotions, and especially negative ones. A lot of Christians assume that grief is wrong or that anger is always sinful, or they think that Jesus wants us to be happy and smiling all the time. But that type of thinking just isn't biblical, and it sets up unrealistic expectations for people's lives. Pretending to be happy is a cultural thing, it's not a Christian thing, and sometimes life just hurts. And the psalmist models here how to deal with these painful circumstances. We don't just stuff them down, we address them, identify the problem, and tell God exactly how we're feeling. The book of Psalms shows us that God can handle any emotion that we throw at him, and we'll see some intense stuff in the book. But look what he says next. "You, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high." So after we trust God with our deepest emotions, we declare the truth about him, and that's usually the hardest part. David's life was threatened, but he knew that God was a shield around him, and he declared that truth. And I wonder how much he felt that in the moment. But he presses into the security of God. He knows that as a shield, God will protect his most vulnerable parts. And he calls God his glory, a word which means weight or heaviness. In other words, God is what truly matters to David. It's a statement of priorities. This guy has come to the end of himself, and he knows that the only way that he can have any kind of help in this situation is if God graciously chooses to act. Then David says this, "I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me." How many times have you laid awake at night just worrying about things that were beyond your control? We all do that. But David's able to get a good night's sleep, not because his situation changed before bed, but because he brought his concerns before God and declared the truth of God over it. Is your soul restless? Remind yourself of what's true, and then choose to walk in that truth. David says, "I will not fear though tens of thousands assail me on every side." That doesn't mean he'll never have moments of fear, but he's not going to allow fear to have that weight and heaviness in his life. That belongs to God. So he's not going to stay awake and nurse that fear and imagine every possible scenario that could go wrong. He says, "You, God, are my glory. You are what matters and what keeps me going." But he doesn't stop praying. You can be at peace in a situation and still want God to act. And sometimes he'll change the situation and sometimes he won't. But scripture encourages us to pray and live boldly. The next part is shocking. "Arise, O Lord, strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked." So even once he's gotten a good night's sleep, he wakes up and he's ticked off. And he wants God to enact vengeance on his enemies. We'll talk more about praying through our anger when we get to other Psalms, but two things to notice here. One is, when we have been abused or mistreated or oppressed, we have every right to be angry, and we should be. And second, notice that in his expression of anger, he puts it in God's hands. Sometimes we stuff our anger down and become depressed and cynical, or we can let it lead us into seeking our own revenge. But David is praying that God would be the one to tear down his enemies. He doesn't pray for an opportunity to do it himself. And as Christians walking in the light of Jesus, we have an obligation to love our enemies and bless those who persecute us. But we'll all face anger from time to time, and we need to be prepared to put it in God's hands. Now, it's interesting that God answers his prayer in a very unexpected way. 2 Samuel tells us that Absalom had this beautiful flowing hair that gets caught in an oak tree when he's riding to kill David, and David's men come in and kill him. But our stories don't always resolve neatly and cleanly, do they? For some of us, the battle rages on. And this psalm seems to end before God ever answers David's prayer. But David has become more confident in his hope. His identity has gone from being threatened to being secure in the presence and truth of God. So he has this reorientation that helps him to see the bigger picture. So he continues to trust, to the point that he's able to get a good night's sleep. And for some of us, that's just enough.